In this video, we'll be studying a Bloomberg news roundup of Bloomberg politics. So we are going to be studying some basic terminology such as fiscal policy, GDP, fiscal deficit, Republicans and Democrats. When the pandemic hit, governments threw out the rule book on spending to save their economies from collapse. The government throwing out the rule book on spending, this suggests that the government has implementing fiscal policy in a very different way. So here, instead of throw out the rule book, we can say to rip up the rule book or to tear up the rule book. This means to do something in a way that is very different to how it is done traditionally. Now a debate is looming over how long they can or should keep the cash flowing. Canada represents one end of the spectrum, piling further funds yesterday into its COVID-19 response. Canada shows one way of implementing fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is the process by which a government regulates or controls its spending. Canada determines that the best way to implement this fiscal policy is to inject into its Canadian economy a huge sum of money. That's on top of spending forecast to drive this year's fiscal deficit to 17.5% of gross domestic output. Let's take a look at two terms. Fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is a shortage in a government's income compared to its spending. A fiscal deficit is characterized by a government spending beyond its means. GDP, GDI, and GDO. Gross domestic output is defined as the average of GDP and GDI. GDP and GDI are, confusingly, the same things. So if Canada's fiscal deficit is going to be 17% of gross domestic output, this means that the North American country will be spending beyond its means by 17.5% compared to its total monetary or market value of all finished goods and services. Then there's the US, where Republicans and Democrats have widely different views on how much more money is needed. Democrats have accused Donald Trump's Treasury of trying to hobble President-elect Joe Biden's fledgling administration by restricting its access to unspent stimulus funds. The Republicans advocate restricted government participation in economic decisions. On the other hand, the Democrats support the idea that government intervention is needed to regulate the economy. To hobble means to limit. In other words, the Democrats, they support or they advocate government intervention to regulate the economy. So they promote the idea of increased fiscal policy. But the Democrats have accused the Republicans' Treasury or Donald Trump's Treasury of trying to limit or trying to hobble the newly elected Joe Biden's Democratic administration because the Republicans, they have limited access to unspent stimulus funds. So here we have a clash of ideologies between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats want to encourage spending, whereas the Republicans want to limit it. To summarize, fiscal policy is a process by which a government controls spending levels. GDP is gross domestic product, or the total monetary value of all finished goods and services in a specific period of time. Fiscal deficit is characterized as a shortage in a government's income compared to its spending. So a fiscal deficit shows that government is spending money beyond its means. And then we looked at the Republican Party, which supports restricted government participation in economic decisions, whereas the Democrats, they support this idea of government intervening and regulating the economy with quantitative easing and so on, printing money.